Hey students, this is Mr. Moore and I'm back with you for this AP European History Review. And we're currently going over Unit 1 on the Renaissance and Exploration, covering the first time period from 1450 to 1648. Topic 1.7, Rivals on the World Stage. And this, of course, is going to talk all about exploration. But more than exploration, it's going to cover the interconnectedness of the European countries as they fought, struggled, and competed with each other for dominance on the world stage. Spoiler alert, England's going to win out. The British are going to get the biggest empire the world has ever seen. So let's go ahead and dive into it. Learning Objective I, explain how and why trading networks and colonial expansion affected relations between and among European states. As they compete for overseas market, it's going to cause a string of conflicts and wars. And it's going to start right away. Right when the Portuguese and the Spanish are first starting off, there's going to be conflict and rivalry. This first bullet point says Europeans established overseas empires and trade networks through coercion and negotiation. Coercion meaning by force, and negotiation meaning, hey, I can do this for you if you do that for me. Sometimes called a tit for tat process. And it's used throughout different kinds of negotiations and people who are interrelated with each other. It's not seen as a very positive thing, though. You do this for me, and I'll do that for you. It can benefit some people, but it can also have a very negative connotation to it. So, the Spanish established colonies across the Americas, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, which made Spain a dominant state in Europe in the 16th century. Again, when we say 16th century, we mean 1500s. I'm going to go back to some slides that I've used in class and remind you of what the Spanish Empire looked like. If we look at the Spanish Empire, you can see that during the 1400s, they're up and coming, and during the 1500s, we might say they hit their peak. And almost the entirety of North and South America are being dominated and controlled by the Spanish. Even when the United States becomes a country, Florida is not a part of the original 13 colonies. That was Spanish territory, and that wasn't acquired from Spain until much later. So you can see the vast majority of the Americas and the Caribbean, because of course it was Spain that was funding a lot of the original exploration things. Obviously one of the most important ones that they ever engaged in was funding Christopher Columbus, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, right? They joined their kingdoms together and they fund Columbus's voyages of discovery. Columbus thought he was sailing out into the ocean, and because the world is round, he was going to end up on these islands here. That makes complete sense if you think about it logically. But of course, he was missing that cartography piece of the puzzle of North and South America, and so that becomes obviously critical to the understanding of the requisition of the Americas under the Spanish flag. The next bullet point says the Atlantic nations of France, England, and the Netherlands followed by establishing their own colonies and trade networks to compete with Portuguese and Spanish dominance in the 17th century. So by the 17th century, that means the 1600s, the Netherlands, the Dutch, and the French and the English are going to also create these giant empires. The Portuguese, again, set up that trading empire. The French are going to accumulate a gigantic empire, but it's going to be later. There's no doubt that the French Empire is going to come much later, along with the British Empire. It definitely is the Portuguese and the Spanish in the beginning, and then later followed up by the Dutch, the French, and the British. The British are going to come out on top. But as we're looking at this right here, these Atlantic nations. This might be a good time to kind of point out how there's a power shift in Europe during this time period. So in the 1450s, say 1453, there was a piece of the old Roman Empire that still existed on the planet Earth. And that piece of the Roman Empire is called by historians the Byzantine Empire. And I'm kind of circling right here. It was centered on a city called Constantinople, which on a modern map you'll find Istanbul. That was the old city of Constantinople. And there was a group of Turks. The Turks are from Central Asia, and over time these Turks, different groups of Turks had migrated and were used as mercenaries by some of the Muslim kingdoms in medieval times. And there was a particular group of Turks known as the Ottoman Turks that really established a giant kingdom, empire, in this part of the world that today, of course, is presently called Turkey. And these Ottoman Turks were able to conquer Constantinople and effectively shut off Asian trade from the Europeans. The Byzantine Empire was a Christian empire, an Orthodox Christian empire, but it allowed trade from Asia to flow into Europe, and it made Constantinople rich. But when the Ottoman Turks destroyed Constantinople, and this became a Muslim trading port, it really cut off and really crippled Christian kingdoms and empires in Europe. And so these Europeans were looking for a way to get to Asian markets, and going across land is not an option. Carrying goods on land is different than carrying them on water. It's like when I was a young father and I'd be sitting in the swimming pool with my kids could hold me up with one hand in the water, and on land, if they tried to hold me up with one hand, I would crush them, right? So weight distribution in water makes it so that the only way to really trade goods in the world is to do it by sea. That's why we still do it to this day. Almost all trade internationally is done by sea. So what all this is saying is that European powers were looking for a way to get access to Asian markets, and there's two theories. You either go across the ocean, and you end up over here because, of course, they forgot about North and South America, as we just discussed. Or the other theory was to go around Africa, but they weren't even sure if Africa had an end, the way I have this map positioned. They were kind of worried that maybe you got too far down and you'd end up into ice fields and there would be no end to it. But it turns out that Bartolomeo Diaz proved it was possible, and Da Gama does actually go around, whereas Christopher Columbus ends up landing in the West Indies when he thinks he's in the East Indies. And so that's kind of what we're talking about right here. These colonies, this competition for trade led to conflicts and rivalries among European powers in the 16 and 1700s. When it says 17th and 18th century, that's 16 and 1700s. And so we're going to see really those five countries, empires that I keep discussing: the Portuguese and the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, and the English, or the British. Those are going to be the five dominant overseas colonizers. Okay, illustrative examples of the period. Colonial effects and rivalries, conflicts and rivalries. Colonial conflicts and rivalries. This first key idea right here, the asiento, is it was the license issued by the Spanish crown by which a set of merchants received the monopoly on a trade route or product. An example of it was the payment of a fee granting legal permission to sell a fixed number of African slaves in the colonies. So this is like a royal decree, if you will, a license by the Spanish crown that gave you permission to be engaged in a certain kind of trade, in this case, slavery. But it could give you like permission to dominate the tobacco industry. In fact, the first guy who ever got involved in growing tobacco in the British colonies could have been arrested and hung as a traitor to the Spanish crown if he had been captured, because the Spanish had a monopoly on tobacco, and they didn't let even transporting the seeds of tobacco plants could get you the death penalty, because they were really trying to dominate a particular market. And so these royal license, these royal creeds from the Spanish crown, gave merchants the power and the ability to dominate trade in a particular area. And tobacco comes to my mind as one of those big ones. The War of Spanish Succession, a European conflict of the early 18th century, here's the dates, 1700s, triggered by the death of the childless Charles II of Spain. The conflict threatened the balance of power in Europe, but the Treaty of Utrecht effectively ended Louis XIV's territorial expansion. So as a part of this review, I'm not really talking about Louis the 14th per se, but I do want to talk about the War of Spanish Succession for a few minutes. You can always, when you're doing this review, you can see where I'm pulling the information out of, if you want to go to my website and pull the notes up yourself and look at that longer. But Charles II was the King of Spain, and he died without an heir. And in his will, he gave his crown to the French prince, Philippe of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV. If France ruled Spain, because everybody knows Louis XIV is one of the most powerful monarchs in the history of Europe. So if his grandson becomes the king of Spain, everybody in Europe knows that Louis XIV is really going to be running the show, because he's going to have influence over his grandson. And so European monarchs would see this as a major blow to the balance of power. Louis XIV was already the most wealthy, powerful dude in Europe during the late 1600s and early 1700s. And so to get Spain is not just to get Spain. If I could just remind you, to get the country of Spain at this time is to get almost all of North and South America. And so effectively France would be quadrupling its size, right? It would just be unbelievable. And so most of the other rulers in Europe just figured that was not going to happen. And so this is a war where everybody is willing to gang up on France to be able to make sure that France doesn't get control of Spain. And the balance of power is interesting, because sometimes even enemy countries will join together to keep another one in check, if you will. And so that's the Spanish War of Succession is really significant in that regards. The 7 Years' War is maybe one of the most important wars to happen during the 1700s. And it's interesting to me, honestly, that the College Board would place this in the 1450 to 1648 review. But nonetheless, it is a great example of colonial conflicts and rivalries. So I can see why that they're using this as an example, but it doesn't fit within the time frame of this first unit. And just a little side note here: if you are writing on a AP test and you're using examples, make sure that you use examples from the time frame given, or those examples will not work. So it's interesting to me that the College Board chose to place the 7 Years' War here. I talked about the 7 Years' War during week 12, much later, because that's really when the 7 Years' War happens. And the 7 Years' War is going to directly lead to the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So the 7 Years' War is epically significant. There's fighting that takes place globally. Sometimes the 7 Years' War is referred to as the French and Indian War. A British general named George Washington serves. He fights against the French in this French and Indian War. I only point that out because, of course, George Washington later, a decade or two later, he's going to be fighting against the British and getting French help. So the 7 Years' War is sometimes seen as the second part of the War of Austrian Succession. And this war takes place globally. And it costs so much money that the British start charging their colonies taxes. and that tax is going to lead to rebellion, right? That no taxation without representation. I mean, that's where I took in my notes. I went in and talked about the whole tax, like the tea tax and the stamp acts and the paper goods that were being taxed, and the whole idea, and that leading to the American Revolution. So in my class, this was much later on, but the College Board has nonetheless placed this as an example, and it really is a great example of colonial conflicts and rivalries, but just pointing that out. This one right here, and like I said, a global conflict between France and Great Britain and their allies. Okay. In North America, this conflict is known as the French and Indian War. This conflict leads to the American Revolution and French Revolutions, as we just stated. The last piece of this puzzle on this particular review, we're doing just 1.7, rivalries on the world stage. The last one is the Treaty of Tordesillas, and this one clearly does happen during the 1450s to 1648. And the Treaty of Tordesillas is incredibly significant. It's a line of demarcation that was negotiated by the Pope. If you'll remember, on our map of Europe, Spain and Portugal both occupy what's known as the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, this peninsula right here, surrounded almost entirely by water. It's a chain of mountains that kind of makes a natural boundary between France and Spain. Spain and Portugal share a lot of common history. Portuguese, the language, and Spanish, the language, are incredibly similar. I have a brother that lived in Portugal for 2 years, speaks fluent Portuguese, and when he went to college, he tested out of all of his Spanish classes, honestly, without even speaking Spanish, because he saw the roots of the words and knew those roots, and was able to test out of all of his Spanish college classes and got tons of easy college credit because he was fluent in Portuguese. So they share this common history and culture between the Spanish and the Portuguese. Different countries, but very much related to each other. And they were in competition around the world. And so as they were acquiring overseas territories, they were almost ready to go to war over which territory they were going to be able to control. And so they asked the Pope to negotiate, and they drew an arbitrary line, right? We talked about latitude and longitude, so they drew a line of longitude right here. This is right after Columbus discovers the Americas, and it says that everything on this side is Spanish territory, and everything on this side is going to be Portuguese territory. And so that's why you see the Portuguese dominating Indian Ocean trade, and why you see the Spanish dominating the Americas during the 15, and to a certain extent even into the 1600s. The Spanish and the Portuguese are dominating. By the time we get to the 17 and 1800s, it's really going to shift over to the French and the British, who are going to be competing for power. Thanks again for listening in. This concludes my discussion of topic 1.7, rivals on the world stage, and I'll be back later with my dialogue, discussion, and a little bit of trying to elaborate on the content that you will need to understand Unit 1, the Renaissance and Exploration.